Have you ever watched an outfit on screen and thought, I need to make that? Well, today we're going to be sewing Jinu's cloak from the ending scene of the K-pop Demon Hunters movie, and I'm going to be sewing it for my husband. I'm going to walk you through every step from stitching the cloak to adding those lightning flames and the chain detail at the end. You can grab the pattern in the description below and sew right along with me. Hi, I'm Christina, and I love to turn designs into wearable art through digital pattern making. And I am super excited to get started on Jinu's cloak. So let's go. I'm going to start by calibrating my projector, and once it's calibrated, I'm going to lay out my fabric and upload my pattern. I am using patternprojector.com. It really is an amazing website. It helps calibrate fast. It's easy to put your patterns up and get cutting quickly. If you have a projector and have not tried it out yet, I highly recommend trying it out. I'm going to start by cutting out the two fronts of my pattern piece. I'm next going to cut out the sleeve. Whenever I'm cutting with my projector and I have straight lines, I always find it very handy to use a rotary cutter and a straight edge to cut those straight lines. This is in case my fabric is wanting to kind of bounce up a little bit, specifically near folds. The fabric doesn't always want to lay flush to the table, and it can make sure that you are cutting on the exact line you want with the projector. Now it is on to cutting the center back. I am adding an extra 2 inches on the center back of my pattern here. This is in case I ever want to let it out a little bit. I have not actually done a mock-up for my husband for this pattern, and I want to make sure that it fits him beautifully before I finalize it. So adding an extra 2 inches in the center back for that little bit of ease is a really great way to do it. In the pattern provided, there is only a 1/2 inch seam allowance there, just like it is everywhere else in that pattern. So that is something to note. If you are just going straight into fabric, that is one way you can definitely make sure that you have enough fabric, is add 2 inches in the center back and 1 inch at each of the side seams. That gives you a lot of play. You then will either have to trim it out or deal with it later. Just depends on what you want to do. And finally, I'm going to cut out the collar pieces. Once everything's cut, I'm going to move over to my serger, and I'm going to serge the body pieces, the front and the back, and the sleeve pieces. I'm not going to serge the collar piece yet because I'm going to bag out that collar. I don't want extra bulk inside the collar, so I will be serging that later once it's bagged out. If you do not have a serger, there are a couple different ways that you can do to prolong your costume. You can bind the edges, you can go with a regular sewing machine and do a zigzag stitch and a small tiny straight stitch right next to the edge. That will help with fraying. Or you could even do something like fray check the edges. Whenever I'm finishing a garment, I always think about what is the end goal for the garment, how long do I want it to last, versus how much time can I put into it currently. That helps me make the decision on how I'm finishing the insides. Now that my edges are all serged, I'm going to start by making the collar. I'm going to start by bagging out the collar so I can have the seam allowance easily accessible if I need to let out the center back. When I was cutting this, I definitely also added 2 inches at the center back of the collar. I'm going to stitch up the front edge of the collar and then the top edge all the way up to that center back point on both of my collars. Once that is done, I'm going to move over to the ironing board, and I'm going to clip the corners. Whenever you're turning a corner like this, it's always best to clip away that extra fabric so that you don't have a lot of extra bulk, making it so you can't make a nice crisp corner. Then I'm going to use this tailor point to iron open the seam allowances. This will really help make sure that you have a really nice crisp corner because you get to press open your seams as you go before you flip it to the right side. Pressing as you go is really what makes the difference between a lower quality garment and a high quality garment. It's going to make your garments look that much better. I know it takes a little bit of extra time to go over to the ironing board and do the pressing all the time. However, it really makes the difference. Once your seams are pressed open, I'm going to flip it to the right side, use a point turner to get that corner nice and pointed, and do one more press all along that collar. Once the first half of my collar is done, I'm going to do the exact same with the other half of the collar. Clip, press open the seams, use a point turner to get the point nice and crisp, and then one final iron. Now that I have my collar bagged out, I want to serge my raw edges, which means I am serging my collar shut. This will make sure that the inside stays nice and clean and cohesive with the rest of the garment. Now it's back to the sewing machine to put the cloak together. I have a 2-inch center back seam, so I'm first going to tape out that seam allowance on my sewing machine since I don't have the stitch lines marked. If you ever have a larger seam allowance than you ever have marked on your machine, you can easily take a piece of tape and tape it down at that width. That way you can measure from the seam allowance of that width. Now that I have that taped out, with right sides together, I'm going to sew my center back seam from the top to the notch. I don't want to sew all the way down to the hem because this garment has a slit on both the center back seam and the side seams. Next is on to sewing the shoulder seams and the side seams. I'm going to line up my shoulder seams with right sides together and sew them across. Next, I'm going to move to the side seam. I'm going to start at the arm's eye and sew down the side seam to the notch. Again, you don't want to sew all the way down to the hem because we have slits starting about at the waist all the way down to the hem. I'm going to go ahead and repeat this on the other shoulder seam and other side seam. Once everything's sewn, I'm going to move over to my ironing board and I'm going to press open all of my seams. I'm going to start by just pressing open the areas that I have already stitched, but then I am going to go ahead and move on to pressing down the rest of the seam allowances. If you added seam allowance to your center back or to your side seam, this is when you can either decide you're going to press all of that seam allowance back, or you can angle it slightly and have it go out to an inch or a ½ inch, whichever you decide. I decided to angle it just a little bit to give my husband a little bit more width at the bottom so that we could put on those really fun flames. We are going to be finishing the hem of the cloak before we put on those flames so that none of the flames are on the underside or the hem of the cloak. Now we're going to finish the collar. I'm going to start by putting right sides together and sewing that center back seam. Once it's sewn, I'm going to run over to the ironing board really fast and press open that seam. Again, it's a pain, but you got to do it. Once it's pressed open, again with right sides together, I'm going to line up the center back seam and the shoulder notches all the way down the center front to where the collar ends. Once it's all pinned, I'm going to stitch the collar to the cloak. Once the collar is on the cloak, we're going to move back over to the ironing board and press open that seam and then press that seam towards the inside of the cloak. This will help when we are finishing the front edge of the jacket. We're going to top stitch this seam allowance down while we finish the front edge of the jacket. So after you've pressed the collar open and then to the one side, go ahead and press the front edge of the cloak back the width of the seam allowance. Now it's back to the sewing machine to finish all of those raw edges. I'm going to start at the hem of the center front and I'm going to work my way up and around the edge of the collar. You want to make sure that you're catching the seam allowance. I decided to sew from the right side because it's sometimes easier to make sure to get a nice and even stitch all the way around when you're not distracted by possibly catching the serging or anything else that's on the back of the fabric. Once I get up to the collar, I want to make sure that I am catching all of the seam allowances there to help with that top stitch and keep the collar going in the direction I want it to. Once we go up and around the collar, we're going to continue going down to the other hem. This is one long stitch from hem to hem. Now that we have the center front hemmed, it's time to hem the side seams and the center back. Since they're already pressed, we can go ahead and go straight into stitching from hem to hem. We're going to go up one of the side seams from the hem up to just above where the notch is, turn 90 degrees, stitch over to your other panel, and then stitch back down the other side to the hem. We're going to do this on both sides as well as the center back seams. I am finishing the garment before I add on those fun lightning bolts so that I know exactly the area I'm working with when adding on the fun lightning flames. Next, you're going to want to try on your garment and see how much you're going to want to put into the deep hem. I built in 2 inches into this hem for my husband. However, you might want it a little bit longer or a little bit shorter. Now is the time to try it on and get those lengths. And then we're going to hem across all 4 panels. Turn it up the amount you want and do a straight stitch all the way across. Make sure that you line up each of the sides evenly so nothing sticks out. If you made your seam allowances taper out just a little bit, you might have to have a tiny tuck on either side to make sure that they match up perfectly. Now it's time to add those flames. The first thing we need to do is create the fabric. If you're not creating the fabric, if you're just using a vinyl or anything like that, you can go straight to the cutting. But we found this really great iridescent fabric that we want to use for the flames. We're going to start by getting some of the iron-on webbing with the paper backing. This way we can iron on the webbing to this fabric so that we'll have double-sided webbing. Then all we will have to do is cut it out, place it on the garment, and iron it on. We are first cutting out the squares of the fabric and of the webbing that will fit onto my Cricut mat so that my Cricut can do all the cutting for us. Then we're going to move over to the ironing board and we're going to iron the two together. Whenever I'm working with this webbing stuff, I try never to iron directly onto my ironing board. I always put a piece of muslin down or a piece of scrap fabric that if a little bit of the glue bleeds through, I'm not saddened because it is gluing to my ironing board. One tip I have for working with this webbing is patience. It takes a long time to get the glue to stick down, so take some time and be patient with it because it will take longer than you want it to. Once it's all ironed out, you can either cut it out by hand or you can cut it out by Cricut. We decided to do a mix of both. We had a few cut out by hand and a few cut out by our Cricut so we could see which one we liked best. Once you have them all cut out, either by hand or by Cricut, it's time to actually place them onto your garment. This is the really fun part. You get to kind of design it and place it at the same time. What we decided to do was place 1 or 2 pieces at a time and then iron them down. So you're going to peel off the paper backing, then you are going to place it down on the hem of your garment. Then you are going to iron it down. Again, with this webbing, the ironing will take a little bit longer than you want it to. So be patient, put a pressing cloth over top, and hang out and know this is going to be a long process. We are going to do this on the 4 panels around the hem as well as the sleeve. However, we have not talked about the sleeve yet, so if you are going to do it on the sleeve, I recommend that you either decide that it's okay to have a little bit of the blue on the inside of the hem of the sleeve, or you can go ahead and hem your sleeve first. I decided to hem my sleeve first, so I had as much of the blue on the edge of the sleeve as I could. If you are unsure of your sleeve length, you can do a basting stitch to close your sleeve up, baste it or pin it onto your garment to make sure you are happy with where the sleeve hem is hitting. Whenever you're trying to finish a garment before putting on the final details, and it's easier to put on the details before it's sewn, you sometimes have to construct and then deconstruct. You can also put the lightning flames on the sleeve after it is sewn. It's just a little bit more of a pain. Now that you have your lightning flames on your sleeve, we can construct it. I decided to already hem it, so the hemming's done. With right sides together, I'm going to line up the hem of the sleeve, and then I'm going to sew from hem to armpit of the underarm seam. I also need to put in the basting gathering stitches over the cap of the sleeve. If you forget to do this while your sleeve is still flat, which I did, I commonly seem to forget this, you can still easily put them in now. These gathering stitches are very important for getting the nice ease over that shoulder into the arm's eye. So make sure you put in those 2 rows of basting stitches around the cap of your sleeve. Once you have one sleeve done, make sure you do the other one. And once both sleeves are done, you guessed it, we're going to move back over to the ironing board and press open that underarm seam. Once the underarm seam is pressed, it's back to the sewing machine where we are going to pin in our sleeve. Make sure that you are sewing the correct sleeve to the correct side so that your sleeves hang properly. I always start by lining up the underarm seam with the side seam, then work my way up and around to where the basting threads start. I do this on both the front and the back. Next, you're going to want to pull your basting stitches so you have a nice little easement around the cap. And we're also going to want to pin in that easement. We want to make sure it's easing nice and even. Sometimes people like to put a little bit more ease towards the back instead of the front so the arm swings forward. However, that is a choice that is completely up to you. Once everything is pinned in, we're going to pull that sewing machine close to us and we are going to stitch in the sleeve. As you are stitching in the sleeve, be careful of all those pins. Whenever I do sleeves, this is when I get stabbed the most. I also work a little bit slower around when I'm doing the sleeves because depending on how the sleeve goes in, I don't always pull my pins as I sew. Once you have sewn in both of your sleeves, it's time to go back to the ironing board, press open that seam, and try on your brand new cloak. Ooh, you are so close to finish now. The only thing that's left is to add on the chain from the front. We decided to put 2 different jump rings at 2 different heights on the front of the cloak. We just whip stitched them on, and then we added some chain to one of the sides, and we added a lobster claw to the other. This gave it its final detail, and now this cloak is ready to wear and have a great Halloween night out. I absolutely love how it turned out. Your Jinu cloak is officially complete. How amazing does it look? If you're loving this series, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button because I have more K-pop inspired costumes coming. A few more pieces from Jinu, as well as some of Rumi's golden look. And if you're interested about learning more about digital pattern drafting in Cloak 3D, make sure to check out my quick start course that pairs perfectly with the 2-week free trial you can get from Cloak 3D. Thanks again for sewing along with me. I look forward to seeing you in some of my other videos. Happy sewing!